And I'm going to ask to jump now to the next period where sectarian tensions really blow up again, and that's in 1950. So we're going to miss out on the Depression because that's a split over how to deal with the Depression, and Joe Lyons being scared to be risky and scared to spend money, as Ted Theodore said he should, but they didn't have the tools to deal with the Depression. The three Keynes came. So it's a slightly different story. Let's go to the 1950s, Frank. And a lot of the same people are still around, or they've been shaped by those events. The battle lines have been shaped by those events. And also, in the wake of the conscription referendum, there'd been the Russian Revolution, which had changed the global picture completely around where danger lies, what the threats are, what's the relationship between faith and politics. You've now no longer got quite the same immigrant community in the Labor Party. That's going to come later. And that changes Victorian Labor enormously when the migrants from Europe start to come in. But they're not there in number, apart from Mr. Santamaria, who wasn't a member anyway. So Frank tells this story of the 1955 split with a particular edge and passion, which is very compelling.
Thanks, Shannon. Yeah, look, well, speaking of passion, I mean, I can't think of a better illustration of the passions aroused by the split than your own book, Struggletown. I'm thinking particularly of the illustration section, actually, which, so your book was
1980.
Indeed, yes. So Janet's book was 1984, and the illustration section had a piece of graffiti from Richmond at the end of Tyson Street, if I remember rightly, in Richmond, which said "Peon traitor to ALP." So, in other words, some graffiti referring to a figure in the split of 1955 was still visible there at the end of the street in Richmond in 1984. Did you take a photograph, Janet? I'm not sure.
No, my husband took the photograph, so we would have taken it in 1983. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. So that says something, I think, that the legacy of that split hung around for a very long time. In fact, it's often said that in Victorian politics, the great, you could argue that the moment, the kind of almost a final healing was when Steve Bracks became Premier in 1999. Because he was very much, from that Catholic tradition. His father, Stan, in Ballarat, had been a DLP, a Democratic Labor Party activist. The Democratic Labor Party being the party that split away from Labor in after 1955 and was, dominated by Catholics. So when you hear about faith-based parties, it's worth keeping in mind the DLP as an example of that in the 1950s, 60s through to the 70s. But certainly, yes, I mean, Brack's election in 1999, you could argue, was a kind of a healing of those passionate arguments and hatreds, really, that went back to the 1940s and 50s, actually. Often when I'm talking about the split of 1955, and I have to or explain in a few words what it was about, not easy. Sometimes people say, oh, it was a split over communism, or sometimes they say it was the split over Labor's policy or treatment of communism. But that's not really true. I mean, it was also a split over the role of the Catholic Church in Labor movement affairs and Labor movement politics. Very importantly, and I think we've become much more aware of this in the last 20, 25 years, it was a split within Catholic Church as well, a very important split within the Catholic Church that, again, if you know where to look, you can kind of still see, or you could see at least, until they made Archbishop Pell Cardinal and Archbishop of Sydney. But until then, you could kind of see it because there was a split between Melbourne and Sydney over that very question of the role that the church should play in politics, its direct role in politics. So take you back briefly Janet's right. Its origins lie in some ways in 1917, in the Bolshevik Revolution. You could even argue its origins lie further back, and that is in that the kind of gravitation of Catholics to the Labor Party that actually begins, I think, around the time of Federation. So it does precede World War One. You can see it gathering momentum between, about 1900 and 1910. Catholics are certainly, well and truly disproportionately represented in the Labor Party by the time you get to around 1910, and they're not all working class unionists. I mean, you also find farmers in Victoria. You head down to Port Fairy, an area where I suppose 50% of the population was Catholic, and it's no coincidence that Labor didn't win many country seats before World War One, but one that it did win was Port Fairy, and that everything to do with the ways in which Catholics were moving towards the Labor Party. But as Nick has pointed out, as Janet's pointed out, World War One, the conscription crisis really consolidates the Catholic place within the Labor Party. And in a way, what happens in the 1940s and 50s is a working out of that somewhat disproportionate role in which, Catholic bishops and archbishops and the occasional cardinal had often played a very direct role in Labor Party politics, making significant public statements. And this is kind of the legacy that is bequeathed to Labor in the 40s and 50s. So if I could just down a little bit, in 1945, at the end of the war, Labor did something that Labor Party did something it had never done before, and it became directly involved in trade union affairs. And you might think, that can't be right. Labor and the unions are sort of, historically sort of joined at the hip. But it was always the other way around, wasn't it? It was unions in the Labor Party. It was unions that were affiliated with the Labor Party. What happened in 1945 was a kind of, I suppose you might call it, reverse engineering in a way. Some organisations called the industrial groups were founded and formed in a number of places. They lasted longer in some than others, and were, I think, most influential, you would say, in Victoria. The industrial groups were essentially formed by the Labor Party in order to contest union elections against communists and others who were perceived as fellow travellers or close to the Communist Party. So you have this battle going on in the unions from 1945 onwards through into the early 50s between individuals who were aligned with those anti-communist Labor Party industrial groups and others who were outside them, sometimes communists, sometimes aligned with communists, sometimes simply Labor people who didn't like the industrial groups, left-wing Labor Party people who didn't like the industrial group. So this is building up as a major conflict. You have some bitterly contested union elections. The industrial groups make up ground within various unions. They very famously managed to get control of the ironworkers in New South Wales, for instance. I won't go into all the battles, but this is a major sort of a social conflict, if you like, of the period occurring within the unions. Now, sitting behind all this is a rather shadier business. Most of that was happening, in a broadly open kind of way. Broadly open. I mean, people knew it was going on, and industrial groups weren't secret organisations. But behind all this, there's something much shadier going on. And this was happening often in secret. And these were the activities of what was called the movement. And the movement was essentially an organisation of Catholic lay people, mainly men, Catholic laymen. It was, however, supported by the church with finance. It was given moral support by the church. The church appointed chaplains to the movement. So it had this ambiguous status. It came under a tradition going back to the 19th century in France called Catholic Action, was the idea of Catholics getting involved in social and political issues as lay people. So it was all about that, but it also clearly had the fingerprints of the church on it. And going back to conscription, one of the key figures, one of the key bearers, if you like, of those fingerprints was Archbishop Daniel Mannix. By this stage, getting pretty old. I mean, by the mid-50s, what is he? In his 90s, isn't he? I think
In his 90s, yeah.
Died in 1963 at the age of 99, so you can work it out yourself. He's an honorian, I suppose, by the time this is happening. His right-hand man amongst the Catholic laymen is a man called B.A. Santa Maria, Bob Santa Maria, who was of Italian Aeolian background, like my family, indeed, from the very same island as the Bongiornos, called Salina, off the Sicilian coast, is where his parents came from. Santa Maria himself was born in Melbourne. And Santa Maria is the de facto leader of the movement. He's given other titles. He wasn't actually called the president of the movement or anything like that, but he's the de facto leader of it. He's clearly calling the shots. And the movement is it's organised parish level within the Catholic Church, and it is clearly one of the forces sitting behind those industrial groups. So the best way of putting this is that not all industrial groupers, the groupers are often called, is the term, you occasionally hear it still bandied about as an insult, usually in Victorian Labor Party circles, really. But not all groupers were Catholics, but there was a very significant number of Catholics within those industrial groups who were essentially coming out of the movement. Now, the movement was a secret organisation. It did not operate in the open. It was almost certain, well, we know now, it was contrary to Catholic canon law, because Catholic canon law bans secret organisations. But nonetheless, it proceeded happily along. And essentially the split that occurs in 1954-55 really fundamentally is over this particular issue. It's over the control of the labour movement between groups, or the groupers, if you like, with the movement sitting behind them, and essentially everyone else. Now, everyone else was a motley mixture. They weren't all communists by any means. Some of them were quite right-wing Labor figures. AWU eventually, the Australian Workers' Union, eventually turned against the movement. So it became a critical figure in the split on the anti-grouper, the anti-movement side. The old Catholic machine in the inner city of Melbourne, places like Richmond, Collingwood, those families that Janet wrote about in her book on Struggletown, the Luffnans, the O'Connells, the Crimeans, eventually well, not eventually, but they are also kind of outside the movement and the groupers. And so they also range on the other side of this conflict. A number of trades hall bosses who feared the industrial groups and feared the way that the movement was infiltrating are opposed. So it's a kind of battle for power, but it does have this underlying religious sectarian dimension. It does have, an element of ideology, which is around the appropriate response of the Labor Party to communism, which is was a significant force in Australia at the end of the Second World War, 22,000 members, lots of influence in the unions. You couldn't ignore it if you're in the Labor movement. So it is about that, but I think I'd mainly emphasise the power politics dimensions, that this was about place and it was about influence, but also the church dimensions are absolutely fundamental. Personalities do play a role. This became entangled in the battle over leadership of the Labor Party, the role of Herbert Vere-Everett, who was the federal leader at the time, who didn't, I think, play as steady a hand as some might have, and so that probably stoked tensions. Everett eventually comes out openly against the movement towards the end of 1954. I think it's about October, and that certainly is kind of the if you like, the match to the powder keg. But the point I've been making is that, some, I think, very superficial analysis of this, only points to the match to the powder keg and ignores, these, much longer term things. It's a bit like what Nick was describing earlier with conscription. One final thing, no, actually two final things before I finish up here. The Petrov affair, the Petrov defection is also a factor in this, adding to the febrile environment, adding, I think, to some of the more unstable behaviour in which Evatt engages federally. And lastly, the split was national, and Janet was right. I mean, it's clearly one of the great national splits, but it was incredibly differentiated across Australia. So Labor splits very badly in Victoria, and the Democratic Labor Party, the offshoot, as its heartland in Victoria. But the split barely happens in New South Wales, and that was really to do with the position the Catholic Church took up, especially Cardinal Gilroy in New South Wales, who basically says Catholics should stay in the Labor Party and fight for control of it. And that means that you don't get a big bust-up split that you get in Melbourne. And so that's what I meant before when I said there were kind of Sydney and Melbourne positions on all this, and that it was a split within the Catholic Church about how to do politics in Australia. And I won't go into the other states, but you had, they tended to line up behind one or the other of those positions. So split had enormous impact. It helped keep Labor out of power federally. In 1972, it helped keep Labor out of power in Victoria. Early 1982, one of the casualties of the split, the first majority Labor government in Victoria, that of John Cain Sr. The next majority Labor government in Victoria would be that of John Cain Jr. over 30 years later, which I think again dramatises the great impact of the split on the politics of that state. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Frank. I mean, my mother used to be followed home. She was working as a sheet metal worker in the Commonwealth aircraft factory in Newport and in Shiftingham's Bend. And the groupers used to follow her home in the dark through the streets of Newport, used to frighten the hell out of her. And then my father was in the Clerks Union, and he was on the left. If they, or both sides, the communists and the right, would make Somuet look like a child play in terms of branch stacking and stacking of meetings. And so the left's term for all the nice little women who came from the public service to vote for the groupers in the Clerks Union was that they were the Monica Marys. And so they'd sit there and put their hands up. I had order. But the branch stacking was extraordinary, particularly in the northern suburbs. If Brunswick's the heartland of the nutty left now, sorry, Helen, I'm in the League Greens. Brunswick was the heartland of the groupers and Northcote from there on. But, Richmond had always resisted them, and they'd actually had a first attempt of a Catholic takeover had been in 1912, when the Catholic Federation wanted to take over the Labor Party to get state aid for church schools, and that was fought off in Richmond, but not, I think, for very noble reasons. But the other story going on in all this is about sin. It's about the drink, and for many Methodists, their social mission degenerated into being obsessed with controlling alcohol. Although they've got, on the other hand, people like Oswald Barnett with his young companions talking about Christ being the first socialist and beginning to turn a young generation in the Methodist community to Labor. But the thing is about divided loyalties between your native country, your religion, and Labor, and the nation. And we're getting close to time, because I'd like to get questions from the audience, because there's I've got Peter Norden on the chat here, who was the priest at St. Ignatius for a very long time, and Jesuit Social Services, and to get into what it might mean today in terms of caucus loyalty, but also in terms of, now that we have a very complex multicultural society, we had a fairly simple binary one then between Irish descended people, mostly Catholic. Everyone forgets about Irish Protestants, but they did exist, and they were very important in the Irish liberation movement. And then British Protestants. But now we've got multiple faiths, multiple communities, multiple loyalties. Now, to what extent do overseas loyalties have a right to be played out in our politics? For instance, we could, are the Sikhs going to seek support from Labor against the Hindus? Now, that's real. And so to what extent do external groups or groups within a society have the right to expect the Australian Labor Party and the government to fulfil their personal concerns?
Yeah, I mean, Jenna, one of the interesting things about the Catholic, we talk about Catholic domination, really, certainly the disproportionate role that the Catholics played in the party. And yeah, I mean, I think the Scullin cabinet was probably 50% Catholic, roughly. Is that, through those years, the Catholics didn't get state aid out of the Labor Party.
No, that's right.
It's worth keeping that in mind, that this was a party that actually did value the kind of, how shall I put it, the social peace, if you like, that had kind of been, a fragile social peace in some ways, that had kind of been established through that secularism, within the education system. And, Catholics felt hard done by, but they weren't able to actually manipulate the Labor Party into giving them what they wanted. And I think that's, and we often... So go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's very, very, very interesting. Now, there is someone, Gus Viola, who's from Jed Kearney's family. He's her nephew, so that's a family that was very involved in all this. But he thinks there's a fourth split, which occurred over Tampa, and that continues to affect us now. So there's a huge number of people who are affluent, consider themselves progressive, and who haven't been able to vote Labor since Tampa. So again, we've got a group who have had an uneasy relationship with the Labor Party, the middle class, left-oriented people who also have decided that it's actually got to reflect their views rather than accept that the party is a collection of views that has to represent a wide range of people. So we have a problem about how much my view has a right to be represented compared to the party being a blending of many different people from all around the country. So it's a problem about democracy within the party. So I was wondering if we could finish up with your reflections on the dilemma that Fatima Payman has confronted us with. Obviously very sincere, although she shouldn't have been talking to Glenn Drury, because that raises suspicions. Whether she's got an agenda, which I think that's possibly she does, and that's why Albo is so angry with her. But nonetheless, on the question of principle, where does she stand, and what can we learn from it? And should we relax that pledge of loyalty to the caucus view?
I'm going to let Frank bravely answer that first.
I thought this was
Can I just come back to the so-called fourth split or fifth split? I think it's really important. Like the other splits that we talked about, I think the Depression stands alone, but it's important to see what happens in 2001. And you're right, there is a drift of middle-class progressives, so-called post-materialists, the knowledge class, to the Greens, because up to that point, the Greens vote, had sort of hung around 4, 5, 6% nationally. All of a sudden, it jumps up to 9 to 10%. But that didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen with the arrival of the MV Tampa in August of 2001, and then the events of September 11 and that very awful 2001 federal election campaign, punctuated by Howard's declaration, we decide who comes to this country in the circumstances in which they come. Nothing, prima facie, there's nothing wrong with that comment, but he and his ministers were definitely race baiting during that during that election. But if you're going to call it a split's probably too much of a stretch. But this is a much longer process. Many of these people come into the party during the Whitlam years. They're attracted to the Whitlam project. Many of them stay, and also there's an influx after Whitlam is dismissed. Some head to the Democrats. Some jump to the Greens during the Hawke Keating years. But this tension, and the tension between middle class progressives and other radicals, and what you might describe as Labor's traditional blue collar working class base, with its anchor in the unions, is as old as the party itself. So it doesn't come out of nowhere.
No.
So I'd be careful about calling it a fourth or fifth split, but it is definitely. Frank and I talk about it at length. It's definitely we can see it as a significant turning point in the party's fortunes, and it's really still dealing with the fallout from that. And you can see, many of the people who involved with the Teals, you can trace the Teal movement, back to those events as well. But I'm going to let Frank pontificate on Senator Payman.
Yeah,
I will add.
We've already got someone in the chat saying that Payman is just a rat. Not once did she raise her concerns in numerous caucus meetings. She was talking to Drury for a month. Caucus solidarity is paramount. So that's, I think I know that which Don that is. It's a former MP. So
yeah, look, the pledge has always been contested. So I think the very first meeting of New South Wales Labor Party in 1891, 8 new members, straight off refused to sign it. It had critics, I guess, within the party who wanted to be loosened, and from without the party who, outside the party, who've seen it as a blot on politics because of the way it, runs against the exercise of conscience. The kind of older 18th century view, really, of the role of a parliamentarian. It's often associated with Edmund Burke. So it's always, it's always been controversial in one way or another. That said, it came out of a particular history, Nick talked earlier about Labor's kind of particular take on democracy, and I agree with Nick. It is in many ways an importation of trade union culture into politics. It also owed something to the techniques of the Irish Nationalist Party in the 1880s, in the Parnellites, as they were called, in the House of Commons. That does seem to have been something of a model that was influential when Labor was being formed a few years later. So it's always been sort of contested. Now, as to where we are these days, you could argue that there is room for greater flexibility, and many have, that you could have a system, something like you have in the House of Commons, where there are different expectations of discipline according to the nature of the vote being taken. And you might take the view that the particular matter on which Senator Payman crossed the floor wasn't a piece of legislation, it wasn't a matter of confidence, it wasn't a budget bill. Maybe there should be greater room for dissent on certain types of issues. The problem here in the Australian context is our chambers are smaller than, for instance, the House of Commons, and I think that means that there is greater pressure in relation to each and every vote. It's also one of the reasons why we don't really have an independent speaker, because again, no party wants to give up a seat that you would otherwise have to give it. Because remember, the speaker's seat isn't contested for the House of Commons. Now, that's fine if you've got 600 and whatever it is. What is it? 650 seats. If you've got 151 seats in the House of Representatives, it's perhaps not so fine. So the size of the chamber, I think, matters. but there may be greater space, there may be greater scope for flexibility. I mean, we all know about conscience votes, where there are deep matters of, usually religious issues involved. But beyond that, there may be scope for greater flexibility around some kinds of vote. The tragedy of the payment case is, I agree with those who are, I mean, I probably wouldn't take quite as dim a view, but I certainly believe she mismanaged this, and I think could have been a very influential, interesting politician for many years to come, and now won't be. I mean, I think that won't happen. I think that's a tragedy, not least because one of the achievements at the last election was that we ended up with a caucus that was a better reflection of the diversity of Australian society than probably any we've had before. And Labor had every right to congratulate itself on that. And now that looks a bit tarnished. And that's a shame and a tragedy.
Can I just jump in there, Frank? I mean, I've made my case. I think she did the wrong thing. I think she should have spoken in caucus. But I think if the Labor Party prides itself on collectivism, we also have to view this. She's no Billy Hughes. If there's a valid argument to make that this is a collective failure, I don't think that she was. I think she was pre-selected with. She came from a traumatic background. I'm not sure whether she was adequately. This is why things like the Labor Academy are so important. I'm not convinced that she received adequate mentoring before she went into Parliament. And I think she would have found Parliament a very isolating experience. She's an observant Muslim woman, and anyone who's been to Canberra and hung around Parliament for more than a day, it's a boozy, freewheeling place. But booze is, despite all that, the Higgins affair and various reviews, alcohol plays a huge role there, and it's the way people. It's often the way people MPs socialise. Whether it's within the same party, or across the aisle, it plays a huge role. So she would have found it enormously isolating. Well, all that said, I actually think I've actually argued that the pledge is all the more vital in a diverse, multicultural Australia. It's sort of holds ALP together. My argument is, if you're going to loosen the pledge, I don't think the pledge is going to be loosened, but it requires serious debate. We certainly can't have we can't have another sort of example of Kevin Rudd coming along and sort of tossing into the ashtray dustbin of history, a century-old plus tradition like he did in 2007 when he decided that he'd remove the power of caucus to select the ministry. But it's a slippery slope, and I think you would find at some point you do need to draw a line. At some point you would have ALP MPs and senators being picked off one by one, to my mind, from the left and on motive issues such as the war in Gaza, but also potentially from the right. So that's why I think it's important to hold the line. I think it's also holding the line against individualism. I'm not telling people anything that they don't know, but the last Australia over the last 3 or 4 decades, and Labor's played its part in this with its accommodation to neoliberalism or aspects of neoliberalism. Australia's become a much more individualistic society, and it cuts against the grain of Labor's what I call communitarian or collectivist tradition. So I think that's something to be resisted. I think there is something worth preserving in Labor's distinctive collective democracy with the pledge at the parliamentary centre of the ethos. There's just something worth preserving, and I think that in a practical sense, I think in terms of maintaining Labor as a cohesive whole, that yes, people will disagree about what's happening in Gaza, will disagree about what's happening in different parts of the world, but we can come together and agree that there is an agreed core set of Labor values, and it's important that we remember the main game, and we hold ourselves together.
Yeah.
Thank you. Frank, you got a last word?
Yeah, I do, and I think it's also worth making that kind of democratic defence of disciplined party voting. When a voter goes to cast their vote at election time, and they cast it not just for the Labor Party, indeed any of the major parties. The fact that each of those parties practices relatively disciplined voting means that you kind of know what you're voting for. That you know that the party has a policy. We don't have manifestos in the British style in Australia. The party has a policy, has a set of commitments, and if it's doing its job, if it's a good government, it gets into government. If it's a good government, it pursues those commitments, and that's the essence, really, of democratic practice. On the other hand, yes, if you have someone who goes in with a Labor Party label and then starts going a wandering, which is what we've seen with the payment affair, well, we now have a bunch of people in Western Australia who voted for a Labor senator who will now, for the next 4 years, have something other than a Labor senator. That, to me, is not democratic. So that sense, I think, of disciplined voting is worth making. The case I'd make is there may be scope for greater flexibility. One of the interesting things about the payment affair is I think that many people in Australia do find the pledge and the highly disciplined voting these days rather bewildering. They don't understand it because it doesn't, I suppose, belong to the kinds of cultures and mentalities that younger people, perhaps especially now, inhabit. But nonetheless, I think it is worth defending. The broader practice of relatively disciplined party voting is not something that we should be embarrassed about from a democratic.
People under 24 in the workplace, union density is around 3%. So I think Frank makes a really important point.
Yeah.
These concepts, there's no real connection to the union movement. Yes, some of these concepts are completely foreign, and I think there was actually a really interesting article by Chris Wallace in The Conversation, which actually touches on arguments that Frank and I make in our book. The other thing is, if we talk about collective failure, really since Rudd became Prime Minister, the debate in the federal caucus has been almost non-existent. So again, whilst we can ask Senator Payne why she didn't speak up in caucus, well, her experience of caucus is there aren't a lot of dissenting voices. So that would have been her experience. Very little debate. Things are rubber stamped, and I think again, if the party needs, I think the party should take a step back, and there's an argument to be made that lack of debate in caucus, eventually you agree on a collective position and people are bound. But that lack of debate, and I think it spreads to the state parties as well. We also see it at national conference. That's something to be lamented as well.
Yes, I mean, Penny Wong was cross because she had to swallow for a long time the party rejecting her private life, and she had to just suck that up and keep arguing, and that has always been her position. Of course, within caucus, there are people who would have agreed with Senator Payman. So she wasn't alone and she didn't have the self-confidence, perhaps, but she was also getting a lot of support from women senators. The thing is that if we were talking about integrity, and she's making a case for her own integrity, she should resign from the Senate, because she's been elected, particularly in the upper house, on a party ticket, not as an individual. And if she's, it's the decent thing to do would be to resign. But no, she's going to stick in there and take advantage of the job and the position. And I suspect this has all been the work of Maureen Faruqi, it's a scalp for the Greens and they'll use her as a trophy. And this is very unfortunate. And they don't, I think that we don't talk enough about duty and integrity and your sense of responsibility. The party is bigger than you. And if you can't align yourself with it any longer, you are obliged to leave. Sorry to be giving up all that money and that position, but she knew she wouldn't get elected again if she stayed number 3 on the ticket. So that's the other issue, whether she thought she didn't have, it was going to matter any much. But anyway, I think, thank you both very much. If anyone's bursting to ask a question, quickly put it in the chat, but I think probably everyone's tired and had enough. Thank you both for two very, very good bits of storytelling and analysis and giving people a perspective. Can I ask people to raise their hands and thank our speakers by your show of applause? Oh, look, there's Steph. It's got Sonny's got the thing from the Labor conference. I got them for my grandchildren, and they went round saying here and sit down and so on ever after. I think these are things we've got to think about, and I hope that those who've been on the call have found that reflecting on these big battles in his party before, often which had catastrophic outcomes for our voters, for our supporters, for the people we're meant to speak for, and nonetheless reflect of the complexity of Australia. Never think that Australian history is uninteresting or that Australian society is uninteresting. It is as complex as any other. And finally, I now imagine you now realise that the public history of the First World War has been entirely distorted by the right. It's not what happened. And John Howard in particular enlisted the First World War to create a mythology about Australia, but it was also started in the 1920s. And one of the things that the great historian of the First World War, Charles Bean, did was to write working class men out of the narrative. So you do not find the blokes from Struggletown featuring in our story of the First World War. The ideal Australian is a tall bushman, bush boy, bit thick, who'll do as he's told, very loyal, and is not going to be the stunted inner city lad who goes to mass on Sunday. I mean, there were many fewer Catholics in the AIF, but the other thing, bit of background to all of that, there was how much resistance, quiet resistance, there was amongst the working class to the war itself. And they just weren't, and when I was doing Struggletown and finding the evidence of this, that people weren't turning up to fundraising things, then they weren't putting their name down, or they were meant to inform the government of their existence. And my husband, who came from the London working class, said, well, of course not. They're not going to fight in a boss's war. And that was from a Londoner. So there you are. Thank you very much. And everybody do get this book, and you can get it with a discount from the website. It is a wonderful history. It's a wonderful history of Australia. And you can tell we've got two master storytellers in the authors. So thank you, Frank. Thank you, Nick. And thank you.
Thanks, Janet. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Janet. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Nick, again. Thank you, everyone.